Imagine being handed a golden ticket to the most exclusive event of the year, only to realize that the ticket isn't an invitation to a party, it's an invitation to your own public execution. Not a physical one, but something far more cruel. A social ambush designed to strip away the last shred of dignity you have left. That was the nightmare facing Amara Jones. At 42 years old, Amara was a ghost in the very building her father had once helped build. She was a cleaning lady, a woman who moved through the shadows with a mop and a silent prayer, scrubbed the glass that looked out over the city she once owned, and kept her head down so low that people forgot she even had a face. To the elite, she wasn't a person. She was just part of the plumbing. So, when the invitation arrived, sealed in silk and scented with malice, the office went quiet. It was an invitation to the wedding of the century, the union of a powerful CEO and his bride, Liz, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her cold, mafia-style ruthlessness. But Amara knew the truth. This wasn't a gesture of kindness. It was a trap. A joke intended to make a trashy janitor the main entertainment for the city's most dangerous elite. But life has a way of flipping the script. Because on that wedding day, the woman they expected to walk in and smell like bleach walked in like a goddess. The woman they planned to laugh at became the reason they couldn't breathe. What happened next? No one, not even the mafia boss himself, could have seen it coming. Before we dive into the transformation, tell us where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments. Enjoy the story. The skyscraper stood like a jagged glass needle piercing the gray morning sky, a monument to a world that thrived on the crushing weight of those beneath it. Inside, the air was always chilled to a perfect, sterile temperature, smelling of ozone, fresh ink, and expensive cologne. For Amara Jones, this building was more than just a place of work. It was a daily, haunting reminder of a kingdom lost. At 42 years old, her life had been distilled into the rhythmic, circular motion of a floor polisher and the caustic scent of industrial bleach. Every morning, long before the city's elite arrived in their armored SUVs to play God with the economy, Amara was there, a silent guardian of the shadows, scrubbing away the evidence of yesterday's greed. Her hands were the most honest part of her. Once, they had been soft and manicured, the hands of a woman who spent her afternoons in art galleries and her evenings presiding over charity galas. Now, they were mapped with the deep, permanent lines of labor, reddened by harsh chemicals, calloused by the heavy handles of buckets, and stiff from the relentless cold of the marble floors. These were the hands that had once signed the deeds to half the skyline, hands that belonged to the legendary Jones real estate dynasty before the betrayal, the legal lies, and the systematic dismantling of her family's legacy. Now, those same hands were used to ensure that the designer shoes of the people who had orchestrated her father's ruin never met a single speck of dust. In the eyes of the young, ambitious brokers and the cold-faced executives who paced the halls, Amara was effectively invisible. She was part of the infrastructure, as unremarkable as the plumbing or the light fixtures. They would walk past her mid-sentence, discussing multi-million-dollar heists disguised as corporate mergers, never once lowering their voices or acknowledging her presence. They assumed she was too simple to understand the complexities of their world, too broken by her station to actually listen. But Amara was a master of silence. She knew which offices held the scent of desperation, and which mahogany desks hid the documents that could bring the whole tower tumbling down. When you are treated like furniture, you become the most dangerous witness in the room. Every floor she scrubbed was a layer of history. She knew every stain on the carpets, every crack in the stone, and every quiet corner where the powerful went to hide their weaknesses. Her back remained straight, a habit from a former life of elegance that she couldn't quite break, even as the physical toll of the work pulled at her joints. She watched the world from the periphery, a ghost haunting the halls of her own stolen inheritance. She was surviving on the scraps of the prestige she used to own, waiting in the silence, her heart a locked vault of memories and a quiet, simmering strength. She was 42, tired and ignored, but she was still a Jones. And in the deep, dark shadows of the tower, she was beginning to realize that while they had stolen her wealth, they had never managed to steal her soul. The silence of the executive suite was shattered by the rhythmic, aggressive strike of designer heels against the marble, a sound that announced Liz long before she came into view. She didn't just enter a space, she colonized it with the cold, calculated grace of a woman who knew the world was hers for the taking. Liz was the wife of the city's most feared power player, and she carried the heavy, unmistakable aura of a mafia queen, a woman whose beauty was a polished weapon designed to intimidate as much as to dazzle. Her perfume arrived first, a suffocating cloud of rare jasmine and expensive tobacco that seemed to push the very oxygen out of the hallway. Clad in a tailored white suit that cost more than a year of Amara's wages, she moved with a predatory elegance, followed by a pack of socialite shadows who mirrored her every sneer. Amara remained on her knees, her hands steady as she worked a microfiber cloth over a stubborn scuff mark. She felt the temperature in the room drop as Liz drew closer, the air vibrating with the quiet, nervous energy of the staff who suddenly found urgent reasons to look at their screens. Liz stopped directly in front of Amara's cleaning cart, the gleaming points of her $1,000 stilettos coming to a halt just inches from Amara's worn, water-stained work boots. For a long, agonizing moment, there was no sound but the hum of the building's massive cooling system. Liz didn't speak immediately. She preferred to let the silence do the work of grinding Amara into the dirt. She stood there, a vision of untouchable luxury, looking down at the back of Amara's neck like a biologist examining a particularly uninteresting insect. Finally, Liz leaned down, her shadow falling over Amara like a heavy shroud. Her makeup was a masterpiece of cold, porcelain perfection, and her smile was a thin, dangerous line that never reached her eyes. She reached out with a manicured hand, its fingers heavy with diamonds, and touched the handle of Amara's mop with a look of visible disgust. "You really should be more careful where you clean, Amara," Liz whispered, her voice a sharp blade wrapped in the finest silk. She gestured vaguely at the shimmering, vein-patterned stone beneath them, her eyes gleaming with a dark, twisted delight. This floor was imported from a private quarry in Italy. A single square foot of this marble costs more than your entire life, and probably your daughter's too. I'd hate for a common janitor to leave a permanent stain on something so precious. The cruelty in her voice wasn't just a personal jab, it was a systematic reminder of the hierarchy that kept this tower standing. It was a declaration that in Liz's world, people like Amara weren't even considered human, they were merely disposable tools, part of the infrastructure to be used and stepped over. Amara swallowed the insult, her throat tight with a familiar, bitter pride that tasted like ash. She didn't look up, refusing to give Liz the satisfaction of seeing the fire that was beginning to roar in the depths of her soul. Liz let out a soft, mocking laugh that sounded like breaking glass and turned on her heel, her entourage erupting into a synchronized, high-pitched giggle as they followed her toward the executive elevators. Amara watched the reflection of the departing queen in the polished floor, the very floor Liz claimed was worth more than her soul, and for the first time in a decade, she felt her father's blood surging through her veins, cold and ready for war. The afternoon sun hit the executive floor with a blinding, clinical clarity, but it did nothing to lighten the suffocating atmosphere that descended the moment the elevators chimed. Liz didn't just arrive, she staged a takeover. This time, she wasn't alone. She was flanked by her circle of socialites, women who functioned as high-fashion vultures, always circling the room for a weakness to exploit. Amara Jones was at the far end of the lobby, polishing the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. She could feel the vibration of their laughter through the floor, a high, sharp sound that felt like shards of ice. Liz stopped in the center of the open-plan office, her presence halting the busy flow of assistants and junior executives. She wasn't carrying her usual designer bag. Instead, she held a thick, cream-colored box as if it were a holy relic. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on Amara with a predator's precision. With a flick of her wrist, she beckoned the 42-year-old janitor over. "Amara, dear, come here. We have a matter of some importance to discuss in front of everyone." Amara stood up, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm of warning. As she approached, the office went silent. Phones were lowered. Keyboards stopped clicking. Liz waited until the silence was absolute before she opened the box. She pulled out an envelope that was almost offensive in its luxury, thick, silk-textured paper, cream-colored and heavy, sealed with a massive gold wax stamp bearing a mafia-style crest. It was the kind of invitation that signified entrance into a world that people like Amara were only supposed to view from the street. "My wedding to Victoria is this Saturday at the Grand Magnolia Estate," Liz announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. She held the envelope out, dangling it between two fingers like a piece of discarded trash. "And I realized it simply wouldn't be right to celebrate such a refined event without the people who keep our toilets so sparkling. This is for you, Amara. A gift." The laughter from the socialites was instantaneous, a cruel, practiced sound that invited the rest of the office to join in. One of Liz's friends leaned in, her voice a stage whisper. "Do you think she'll wear the mop as a hat, or just come smelling like Pine-Sol?" Liz's smile widened, her eyes fixed on Amara's face, searching for the crack, the tear, the moment of total breakage. She wanted to see Amara realize that her presence at the wedding was intended to be the entertainment, a trashy janitor served up as a side dish for the amusement of the elite. Amara looked at the gold seal, the same type of seal her own family had once used to command respect. She didn't flinch. She took the envelope with a hand that was calloused but perfectly steady. The weight of the paper was a physical reminder of the life she had lost, but the fire in her chest was a reminder of the woman she still was. "Thank you, Liz," Amara said, her voice a calm, low resonance that seemed to unsettle the bride-to-be for a fraction of a second. The trap was set, and Amara held the poison bait in her hand. She watched Liz's retreating back, knowing that by inviting a ghost to her wedding, Liz had just invited the one person who could burn her entire world to the ground. The walk home was a blur of flickering neon lights and the hollow ache of exhaustion that had become Amara's constant companion. Every step up the 5 flights of stairs to her cramped apartment was a penance, a physical reminder of the staggering distance between the penthouse life she once knew and the drafty, dimly lit reality she now endured. Inside, the air was still, smelling faintly of lavender and the dampness of an old building that had seen better days. She dropped her bag on the worn sofa and placed the cream-colored invitation on the small wooden table. It sat there like a ticking bomb, its gold wax seal mocking the cracked plaster on her walls and the flickering light bulb above. For a long time, she simply stared at it, her reflection in the dark window showing a woman the world had tried to break. But as her fingers brushed the heavy, silk-textured paper, a spark of something ancient and fierce flickered to life in her chest. She moved to the back of her narrow closet, pulling aside a stack of old blankets until she reached a heavy, iron-bound trunk. It was covered in a thick, gray layer of dust, the words Jones Dynasty barely visible on the lid. Her hands shook as she wiped away the grime, her heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm she hadn't felt in 15 years. This box was the only thing the lawyers, the associates, and the creditors hadn't been able to touch, a time capsule of a life that felt like a dream she had been violently forced to wake from. She turned the heavy brass key, and the hinges groaned, a sound that felt like a cry for justice echoing from the past. Inside lay the carefully preserved remnants of the woman the city's elite had tried to erase. At the very top was a framed photograph of her parents standing in front of the very skyscraper she now cleaned. Her father, a man of immense vision and quiet power, and her mother, a woman who had taught Amara that grace was a shield, not a weakness. Beneath the photo were the documents that proved her true heritage: founders' certificates, university degrees with high honors, and yellowed newspaper clippings that once heralded her as the crown princess of the skyline. She traced the lines of a headline from the height of their power: Jones Real Estate Dynasty Secures Landmark Urban Deal. She remembered that day vividly. She had been draped in silk then, not polyester. She had been the one making the decisions, not the one scrubbing the floors of the very people who had engineered her family's ruin through forged documents and cold-blooded betrayal. Deep in the corner of the trunk, wrapped in a velvet cloth that had turned silver with age, was a single piece of jewelry, a heavy gold shawl pin, shaped like a soaring phoenix. It had been her mother's most prized possession. Amara gripped it so hard the cold metal bit into her calloused palm, the sharp pain grounding her in a new, lethal reality. She wasn't just a janitor at the Miles Collins Tower. She was the rightful heir to the foundation they were currently standing on. Liz had invited her to the wedding to be a prop, a visual punchline to a cruel, high society joke. But Liz had no idea that the invisible woman she mocked held the keys to every skeleton in her family's closet. Amara looked back at the invitation, her jaw set with a quiet, terrifying resolve. The joke was about to backfire. She wasn't going to that wedding to watch Liz get married. She was going to reclaim her name and remind them all exactly who she was. The moonlight filtered through the grime-streaked window of the small apartment, casting long, jagged shadows across the floorboards that Amara had spent her evening scrubbing. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the weight of the Jones dynasty trunk still pressing into her consciousness like a physical force. In her hand, she held an old, leather-bound address book, the kind of relic that belonged to a time when her life was measured in board meetings and gala dates rather than mop buckets and hourly wages. Her thumb traced the name, Janet Sterling. Janet had been her closest confidant, the woman who had designed Amara's debutante gown before the world turned cold and the lawyers tore the Jones legacy into pieces. Janet had moved to Atlanta, carving out a name for herself as a high-fashion architect for the powerful, but she had never forgotten the woman who had given her her first big break. Amara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone, as she dialed the number. The ringing sound felt like a bridge being built across a vast, dark canyon of years. When a voice finally answered, sharp, elegant, and vibrating with the energy of a woman who commanded rooms, Amara felt her breath catch in her throat. "Janet," she whispered, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears, stripped of its janitor softness and replaced with the steel of her father's daughter. "It's Amara. I think it's time the city stopped seeing a ghost and started seeing a Jones again." The silence on the other end lasted only a second before Janet's voice erupted with a mixture of shock and a fierce, protective joy. "Amara? My God, I've spent a decade looking for you. Where have you been hiding?" The conversation that followed wasn't just a catching up of old friends, it was the drafting of a battle plan. Amara described the wedding, the poisoned invitation from Liz, and the mocking laughter that had echoed through the executive suites of the tower. She spoke of the humiliation Liz intended to serve up as a side dish, and as she talked, the shame that had anchored her to the shadows began to evaporate, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. "I don't just want a dress, Janet," Amara said, her eyes fixed on the cream-colored envelope on her table. "I need a suit of armor. I need something that tells them I didn't just survive their betrayal, I mastered it." Janet didn't hesitate. She was already barking orders to her assistants in the background. "I'm sending a car tonight, Amara. We have 48 hours to turn a janitor back into a queen. We're going to give them a vision of black silk and gold that will haunt their dreams for the next 20 years. By the time Amara hung up, the air in the cramped apartment felt different, charged with the electricity of a coming storm. She wasn't just a woman cleaning floors anymore. She was a woman preparing for a coronation. She looked at her rough, calloused hands and smiled. They were the hands of a worker, yes, but they were also the hands that were about to tear Liz's perfect world apart. The private atelier was a sanctuary of glass, white marble, and the rhythmic, hushed whispers of high-end sewing machines, a world that felt light years away from the echoing, bleach-scented hallways of the Miles Collins Tower. Janet Sterling moved through the space with the fierce, clinical intensity of a commander preparing her finest soldier for battle. There was no room for small talk or hesitation. The clock was ticking toward the Grand Magnolia wedding, and every second was a brushstroke on a masterpiece of vengeance. Janet's team of elite stylists, sworn to absolute secrecy, descended upon Amara like a well-oiled machine. First came the reclamation of her skin, the harsh industrial chemicals and years of neglect being scrubbed away with rare oils and salts that smelled of sandalwood and rebirth. Her hands, those rough, honest hands that had held mops for a decade to survive, were treated with the reverence of a master pianist's. The calluses softened, but the underlying strength of her grip preserved. "We aren't just hiding the janitor, Amara," Janet whispered, adjusting the studio's lighting so that every angle was visible in the floor-to-ceiling mirrors. "We are unearthing the empress they thought they could bury." Then came the garment, the war paint of a woman who had finally decided that she had nothing left to fear. The dress was a masterpiece of sleek, midnight black satin, a fabric so dark and rich it seemed to swallow the light of the atelier. It clung to Amara's frame with a lethal, tailored precision, tracing the straight line of her back and the proud, unyielding set of her shoulders. It was a gown that didn't just fit, it commanded. But the true masterstroke was the gold silk cape that Janet draped across her shoulders, securing it with the family's gold phoenix pin Amara had rescued from her trunk. The cape flowed behind her like a river of liquid sunlight, providing a stark, royal contrast to the black abyss of the dress. It was the gold shawl and cape assembly that turned a silhouette into a statement of war. As the stylist stepped back into the shadows, Amara looked into the mirror and, for the first time in 15 years, she didn't see a ghost or a servant. She saw a woman whose presence could silence a ballroom and freeze the heart of the most arrogant mafia boss. Her hair was braided high into a dark, intricate crown that added inches to her stature, and her face was a canvas of calm, terrifying composure. The makeup was subtle but sharp, emphasizing the regal bone structure that Liz had tried so hard to mock. She wasn't just beautiful, she was formidable. Amara practiced her stride across the marble floor, her heels clicking with a sound that was no longer an echo of labor, but a rhythmic countdown to Liz's social downfall. Every movement of the gold silk cape sent a shimmer across the room, a golden shadow that followed her like a loyal guard. She felt the cool weight of her mother's phoenix pin at her throat, a physical anchor to a lineage of power and resilience. The transformation was absolute. The janitor who knew every secret of the tower had evolved into the queen who would finally reveal them. As the sun set on the eve of the wedding, Amara Jones stood in the center of the room, a vision of black and gold, ready to walk into the lion's den and reclaim the throne that was rightfully hers. The Grand Magnolia Estate at night looked less like a wedding venue and more like a fortress of gold and glass, a shimmering monument to a world that thrived on absolute power and calculated exclusion. Warm golden light from hundreds of crystal chandeliers spilled out onto the marble entrance, creating a soft bouquet effect against the dark, manicured gardens. Thousands of guests, the city's true architects of influence, dressed in tuxedos and gowns that cost more than a year of honest labor, mingled under the watchful eyes of stern men in black suits with discreet earpieces. This was the mafia luxury world Liz called home, a place where every glance was a judgment and every smile was a transaction. In the center of it all stood Liz, the bride, draped in white lace and arrogance, holding a bouquet of ivory roses like a scepter. She was the queen of this curated empire, waiting for her final, cruel punchline to arrive. The silence began at the edge of the long, white-carpeted driveway. A sleek, obsidian-black car rolled to a halt with a hushed, predatory grace. For a heartbeat, the music seemed to falter, and the chatter of 1,000 guests dipped into a curious murmur. The back door opened, and the first thing the onlookers saw were the shoes, 6-inch black stilettos that struck the ground with a rhythmic, lethal precision. Then came the dress, a floor-length gown of sleek black satin that moved like liquid shadow, catching the golden light in its folds. But it was the gold silk cape draped across Amara's shoulders that truly stopped the hearts of everyone watching. It flowed behind her as she stepped into the light, secured by the soaring phoenix pin that shimmered like a warning. Amara Jones didn't just walk, she dominated the space. She moved forward mid-stride, her shoulders back and her chin raised with a calm, powerful expression that radiated a queen-like presence. Every step across the marble reflected the bright chandeliers above, her silhouette cutting a sharp, high-contrast figure against the softly blurred crowd of wealthy onlookers. The hero of the night was in sharp focus, while the elite of the city became nothing more than a hazy background to her arrival. As she neared the grand entrance, the silence became absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that crushed the laughter out of the air. On the right, Liz froze. The bouquet in her hands trembled, her knuckles turning white against the stems. Her mouth opened slightly in a gasp of pure shock and discomfort, her eyes widening as she searched the face of the cleaning lady she had meant to destroy. This wasn't the broken woman in a faded uniform she had mocked in the executive suites. This was a vision of reclaimed sovereignty. Behind them, the wealthy guests stood in stunned disbelief, their champagne glasses forgotten as they stared at the woman who had just hijacked the wedding of the century. A photographer, sensing the shift in gravity, instinctively pivoted his lens, a bright flash capturing the moment Amara Jones walked back into the world that had tried to bury her. Amara didn't look at Liz. She didn't look for approval. She simply walked toward the heart of the estate, her gold cape shimmering like fire, knowing that the story had officially changed. The silence that followed Amara's entrance was a physical weight, a suffocating vacuum that seemed to draw the very air out of the Grand Magnolia's opulent ballroom. In this high-stakes arena of power and pedigree, where every movement was usually a calculated performance, the crowd had been rendered completely motionless. This was the 16:9 moment, a cinematic freeze frame where the world narrowed down to a single, sharp point of focus. Amara Jones was that point. She continued her walk toward the heart of the estate, her heels striking the marble with a deliberate, rhythmic confidence that sounded like a countdown. Every eye in the room was fixed on her, the shallow depth of field blurring the rows of tuxedos and gowns into a soft, golden haze, leaving only Amara in razor-sharp clarity. The golden light from the towering chandeliers caught the shimmer of her silk cape, casting a regal glow that seemed to emanate from within. She didn't scan the room for approval or look for a place to hide. She moved with the controlled dominance of a woman who had already won the war. Behind her, the mafia luxury atmosphere was palpable. Two bodyguards in sharp black suits, their earpieces glinting under the lights, shifted their weight, their faces masks of professional confusion. They were trained to spot threats, but they didn't know how to handle a woman who looked more like royalty than the guests they were paid to protect. Suddenly, the sharp crack of a photographer's flash bulb exploded, a burst of artificial lightning that captured the scene in all its high-contrast glory. The light reflected off the gold phoenix pin at Amara's throat, signaling to everyone present that this wasn't just an arrival, it was a public spectacle. The flash momentarily blinded the room, and when the spots cleared from the guests' eyes, the image of Amara in her black and gold armor was burned into their collective memory. To the right, Liz stood like a statue carved from ice. The white lace of her bridal gown, which had been meant to signify her ultimate triumph, now looked pale and drained of power against the deep, obsidian black of Amara's dress. Liz's mouth was slightly open, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps as her face sold the total shock of the moment. Her eyes were wide, darting over Amara's features, searching for the cleaning lady she had meant to humiliate. Instead, she saw a woman who looked down at her with a neutral, controlled expression, a look of such profound composure that it made Liz's entire wedding feel like a cheap, hollow stage play. The whispers began to ripple through the crowd like a rising tide. They weren't the cruel, snickering laughs from the office hallway. They were the hushed, frantic questions of the elite. Who is she? How did she get in? Does she belong to the Jones family? The tension was a living thing, vibrating between the two women. Amara stopped just a few feet away from the bride, the gold silk of her cape settling around her like a lion's mane. She didn't say a word, but her presence spoke volumes. She had walked into the trap Liz had set, and instead of being caught, she had dismantled it simply by standing still. The stunned silence was her greatest weapon, and as the cameras continued to flash, Amara Jones knew that the invisibility that had protected her for 15 years was officially over. The heavy silence was finally broken not by Liz, but by an elderly man who stepped out from the cluster of dignitaries near the head table. He was a man whose face was etched into the city's history, a retired judge who had seen the rise and fall of every major family for 50 years. He adjusted his spectacles, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the gold phoenix pin at Amara's throat. A gasp escaped his lips, a sound of genuine, trembling recognition that traveled through the room like a physical shockwave. Amara? Amara Jones, he whispered, his voice gaining strength as he moved closer. My God, child. We thought you were gone. We thought the Jones line had ended in that tragedy. The name Jones rippled through the crowd, turning the atmosphere from curiosity to a frantic, hushed reverence. The elite of the city suddenly remembered the skyline they occupied, the foundations built by a family that had been synonymous with honor before the shadows of betrayal had swallowed them whole. The photographers, sensing the shift in the social hierarchy, redoubled their efforts, the flashes now capturing a woman who was no longer a janitor, but a returning heir. Liz's face, once a mask of shock, now contorted into a desperate, ugly panic. She felt the ground shifting beneath her expensive lace, the laughter she had prepared dying in her throat as she realized she had invited a titan to her own playground. This is just a joke, Liz shrieked, her voice cracking as she turned to her husband, the CEO who stood paralyzed by the revelation. She's the help, Victoria. She cleans the toilets on the 42nd floor. She doesn't belong here. But her husband's eyes were not on Liz. They were on the judges and senators who were now nodding toward Amara with a respect they had never shown him. He saw the disaster for what it was, a public exposure of his wife's hollow, petty cruelty. He stepped back from Liz, his silence a crushing divorce from her malice. Amara looked at Liz, her expression remained calm, a neutral mask of absolute dominance that made the bride's white gown look like a shroud of failure. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. A woman of your position should know, Liz, Amara said, her voice a low, melodic resonance that filled the ballroom. That you can buy the building and you can buy the marble, but you can never, ever buy the class required to walk on it. She paused, letting the words sink into the silence of the 1,000 guests. Thank you for the invitation. It's been a long time since I've seen my family's estate from the inside. With a final, regal nod to the judge, Amara turned on her heel. The gold silk of her cape flared behind her like a final, triumphant flame as she walked toward the exit, her head held high. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea, a path of honor carved out of a room that had meant to mock her. As she stepped back into the night, where Janet stood waiting by the obsidian car, the sound of the ballroom's applause followed her, a standing ovation for a queen who had survived the dark. The janitor was gone, and the Jones legacy had just begun its second act. As the lights of the Grand Magnolia Estate faded in the rearview mirror, Amara didn't look back at the wreckage of Liz's reputation or the shattered remains of a wedding meant to mock her. She looked forward into the dark, quiet expanse of a city that was finally hers to reclaim. That night, a janitor didn't just attend a wedding. She reminded the world that the people we choose not to see are often the ones holding the most powerful stories. True royalty isn't found in a white lace dress or a CEO's title. It's found in the strength to keep your back straight when the world tells you to bow. If you believe in stories that inspire, that challenge the status quo, and that give a voice to those the world often ignores, please hit the subscribe button, like, share, comment, and turn on notifications. We have many more powerful journeys of resilience and hidden legacies waiting to be told, and we would love to have you on this journey with us. Don't forget to drop a comment and let us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. We love hearing from our global community. This is Blood and Roses Chronicles, and I'll see you in the next story.